Here is what nobody tells you about warnings. They almost never look like warnings. They do not arrive with sirens attached or caution tape, or the specific crawling sensation at the back of your neck that horror stories promise you will feel. When something is wrong, they arrive looking like ordinary things. A light that flickers once and doesn't flicker again. A neighbor who doesn't wave back. Smell in a room that is not quite right and then is gone before you can name it. A sound that stops when you start listening for it. Warnings look like everything else. That is precisely the problem. I had 17 of them. I have counted. I have gone back through the 31 days before I understood what was happening in the house on Fell Street, and I have found 17 moments that were warnings, clear and specific, and entirely visible in retrospect, and I did not read a single one. This is not a story about supernatural horror, though it has elements you may call that. This is a story about a particular failure of attention, about the way intelligent people who believe they are paying attention, who would describe themselves as observant, can accumulate evidence and refuse to assemble it into the conclusion it demands. About the specific and expensive blindness of assuming that the ordinary world will continue to behave ordinarily even when it has stopped. My name is Sable Nguyen. I'm 29 years old. I am a data analyst who works with pattern recognition systems, and I am telling you this because the irony is not lost on me. My professional life is the identification of anomalies in large data sets. I find the things that don't belong. I am paid to notice what most people don't. I did not notice. This is what happened. The house on Fell Street was not what I would have chosen. If you had shown me a photograph before I agreed to move in, I might have found reasons to hesitate. The Victorian architecture that had been charming once and was now merely tired. The deep front porch that was handsome in summer photographs and would be dark and unwelcoming in November. The way the neighboring houses seemed to lean slightly away from it. The way every house on the block seemed to have slightly more light in its windows than this one. But I had been in my previous apartment for 3 years and my lease had ended, and the rental market in the city had grown so ferocious that what you did when you found a 3-bedroom Victorian with a working fireplace and period moldings for $800 a month under comparable properties was sign the lease before someone else did. You did not hesitate. You did not wonder why a house this good was this affordable. You signed, I signed. I moved in on the 1st of October. 2 weeks later, my roommates arrived. Jonah Say, 31, an urban planner I'd known since college, who was relocating for a new city job and needed housing immediately. And Franny Holt, 27, graphic designer who had answered the shared listing with the best written message I'd ever received from a stranger and who turned out to be, in person, exactly as competent and funny and easy to live with as her written voice had suggested. Jonah was large and calm and had the specific unhurriedness of someone whose sense of self-worth had never been attached to urgency. He unpacked his things over 3 days without apparent concern for disorder in the interim, made excellent breakfasts on weekend mornings, and had a laugh that filled the high-ceilinged rooms in a way that made the house feel inhabited. Franny was small and precise and wore the same 3-color palette in all of her clothing. She said was about reducing decision fatigue, and which resulted in her looking consistently put together in a way admired and could not replicate. She had a cat named Hex, a large gray tabby of indeterminate age and vast personal gravity, whom she had brought without asking permission and who had established dominion over the household within 48 hours in a way that made the question of permission feel retrospectively irrelevant. The first 2 weeks were the honeymoon period that all shared living arrangements have. New people making the effort to be good versions of themselves, the novelty of a new space masking the friction points that would emerge once the novelty wore off. We ate dinner together most nights. We watched films in the sitting room with the fireplace going. We complimented each other's contributions to the shared spaces and laughed about the house's specific Victorian quirks, the third stair that screamed under any weight, the kitchen tap that required a precise quarter-turn counterclockwise to stop dripping, the way the hall light on the second floor would hum for exactly 7 seconds when you switched it on before settling into silence. Ordinary things. Entirely ordinary things. The first warning was on the 14th day. Hex, who was an assertive and territorially confident animal, not given to hesitation or retreat, refused to enter the basement. The basement of the house on Fell Street was ordinary. I had toured it before signing the lease, a finished lower level with a laundry room, a storage room, and a third room that the landlord had described as suitable for an office or a second sitting room. Concrete floor, exposed brick, good. Electrical, a small window well on the north side that let in narrow light. Nothing notable. Hex would not go down the stairs, would not approach the stairs, would sit at the top of the basement staircase and stare downward with the focused, unblinking attention of a cat encountering something it was assessing very seriously. And then it would leave, walk away, not in the panicked way of an animal that has been frightened, but in the deliberate way of an animal that is decided. Hex doesn't do basements, Franny said when I mentioned it. He's always been that way about basements, selective about low spaces. Cats are weird, Jonah said. Warning number 1, filed under animal behavior, probably nothing. Let me list the warnings. Not all 17, there is not space, and some of them are so small that strung together, they sound like the imagination of a person who has decided to find a pattern. But the significant ones, the ones that, in retrospect, make me close my eyes and press the heel of my hand against my forehead in the specific physical expression of, why didn't I see it? Warning number 3. The neighbor across the street, Mrs. Aberford, a woman in her 70s, with a precise garden and the alert eyes of someone who has lived on a block long enough to know its rhythms by heart, she watched us the first 3 times we came and went without acknowledgement. On the 4th occasion, I raised a hand to wave, and she did not wave back. She looked at us at the house with an expression I catalogued as unfriendly and moved on from, because not everyone is obligated to be warm, and unfriendly neighbors are among the most ordinary things in the world. It was not unfriendliness. I understand that now. Something older and more complicated. It was the expression of someone who knew something and had decided that telling you would not help. Warning number 5. In the 3rd week of October, I had a meeting with the landlord, a property management company rather than a person, but the company had sent a representative to address a plumbing issue in the upstairs bathroom. The representative was a young man named Derek, who fixed the plumbing issue efficiently, and who, as he was packing his tools to leave, said, "You all doing okay here?" in a tone that was not the casual closing question tone of a contractor wrapping up a job. It was a checking-in tone. The tone of a question that is actually looking for an answer. "Fine," I said. "Great, actually. We love it here." He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Good," and left. He said it in the way you say good when you mean, "I hope so." Warning number 6. The smell. Not persistent. Not the kind of smell you report to a landlord or investigate seriously. Just an intermittent quality to the air in the basement adjacent. Parts of the house, the kitchen, the back hallway, the bottom of the main staircase. A smell I can only describe as underground. Not mold, not damp, not sewage, something older than any of those. Something geological. Stone that had been wet for a long time, and then dried, and then wet again, over cycles that were not plumbing cycles. It came and went. It was never strong enough to be a problem. I mentioned it to Jonah once, and he said the Victorian was just an old house, and old houses had their own atmospheres. He was right about old houses having their own atmospheres. He was wrong about what this one meant. Warning number 9. The dreams. I am not a person who typically remembers dreams. My nights are efficient and largely blank, the way the nights of busy people tend to be. But in the house on Fell Street, starting in the 3rd week of October and accelerating through November, I dreamed with an intensity and a specificity that was new. Not frightening dreams. This is important. Not nightmares. Just detailed. Vivid, utterly real feeling dreams set entirely in the house. Walking through the rooms in the dark, going down the basement stairs, finding things in the basement that were not there when I was awake. Not terrifying things, just things that didn't belong. Objects and configurations that communicated something I couldn't decode. I mentioned the dreams to Franny one morning. She looked up from her coffee with an expression that was briefly, specifically alert, and then settled into something more ordinary. "I've been dreaming a lot too," she said. "About the house." She paused. "About the basement specifically." "That's probably because Hex won't go down there," I said. "It's made us both give the basement more attention than it deserves." "Probably," she said. But she was looking at Hex, who was sitting in the kitchen doorway facing the direction of the basement stairs with the absolute focused attention he had been applying to that direction for 3 weeks. Warning number 12. Jonah, who had the calm of a person deeply at ease with himself and with the world, started locking his bedroom door at night. I noticed it because his door, which had been consistently open when I passed it in the mornings, was consistently closed. I heard the click of the lock at some point late in the evenings. I didn't ask. It seemed like a private adjustment, too. A private concern. It's the kind of thing you don't ask about if you want to be a good housemate. Warning number 14. It's a sound. This is the one I should have acted on. This is the one that, if I had acted on it, would have changed everything that came after. I know this with the particular clarity of hindsight, and I carry it the way you carry a mistake that mattered. The sound was from the basement, not loud. Never loud. A low, periodic sound that I became aware of gradually. The way you become aware of a sound that has been present for a while before you consciously register it? Rhythmic, like breathing. If breathing were the act of something, much larger than a human body. Not continuous, it came in sequences of 3 or 4 slow cycles, and then stopped. And then resumed minutes or hours later. I heard it first in mid-November, lying awake at 11 at night, and thought it was the building settling. Old houses. "Breathe," Jonah had said about the atmosphere. I applied the same explanation to the sound. Old houses make sounds. The 16th warning was the light. The basement had one ceiling light, a standard fixture that had been updated to LED. At some point, on the 28th day, the light began turning on by itself. Not while anyone was in the basement. While we were on other floors, in our rooms, in the kitchen, I would come down to the main hallway and see the strip of light under the basement. Doran knew that no one had gone down there, and yet the light was on. The first time I attributed it to Franny. The second time I mentioned it at breakfast, and we all disclaimed having turned it on. The third time, I stood in the hallway and watched the strip of light under the basement door and asked myself, honestly, for the first time in 28 days, is what is happening in this house? I did not have an answer. I had not assembled one because I had been filing each warning separately in its own isolated folder, rather than laying them all out and reading the document they made together. The 17th warning, which I also did not read in time, came. The following night, the 17th warning was, Franny at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with her laptop open and Hex pressed against her side and a look on her face that I recognized when I came down for water and found her there. It was the look of someone who has assembled the document. "Sable," she said. Her voice was very steady. "Sit down." I sat. "I've been researching the house," she said. "The address, the history. Started a week ago because I couldn't sleep, and the dreams were very specific. And I'm a designer, and I catalog things visually, and what I kept seeing in the dreams was..." She stopped, organized herself. Franny, when she is processing something difficult, goes very precise, very ordered. The way she is with her 3-color palette and her decision fata reduction systems, she was doing that now. What I kept seeing in the basement was a mark, the same mark repeated, and I couldn't place it, so I drew it, and then I researched it. She turned the laptop to face me. On the screen was a research article. An academic paper from a university press published in a journal of historical architecture and building archaeology. The paper concerned a category of buildings in northeastern American cities in which construction had been carried out over, or incorporating elements of much older subterranean structures predating the city's formal development by significant margins. The paper discussed several case studies. Fell Street was the third case study. The house on Fell Street had been built in 1887, Standard Victorian construction. Documented in the city's historical property records. What the building archaeologists who'd examined the property had found during a survey conducted in the 1990s for an adjacent development project is that the basement of the house sat directly above a much older structure, a chamber of uncertain age and origin, access via a crawl space in the northwest corner of the finished basement floor. The chamber had been documented, photographed, and sealed. The development project had been rerouted. The house had been sold. The article discussed the find in the measured language of academic archaeology. It noted that the chamber contained markings on its stone walls that were consistent with, and here the language became more careful, with practices associated with pre-colonial indigenous land use that emphasized the designation of specific underground spaces as, and I am quoting the academic language directly, sites of reciprocal boundary maintenance. Reciprocal boundary maintenance, I said. I looked that up, Franny said. It's not a standard archaeological term. Paper uses it but doesn't define it. I found one reference to it in another paper, a follow-up by a different researcher, and that paper described the concept as the maintenance of an agreement between human occupants of a site and whatever was understood to occupy the site's subsurface. The agreement required ongoing acknowledgement, regular, specific acknowledgement. I looked at her across the kitchen table, at Hex, who was pressed against her side and looking at the basement door, at the laptop screen. How long, I said slowly, has the house been on the rental market? Franny turned the laptop back to herself, typed for a moment, turned it back. According to property records, she said. It has had 14 sets of tenants since 2001. Average tenancy length, she paused. For months, we looked at each other. It's been exactly 1 month, I said. I know, she said. Should I started? From below us, through the floor. Through the kitchen linoleum and the Victorian subfloor and the poured concrete of the basement floor, the sound came. Not the low-breathing rhythm I'd been attributing to the building settling. This was different. This was deliberate. 3 slow cycles of whatever it was, and then silence. And then 3 more. Hex made a sound I had never heard a cat make. Not a hiss, not a yowl. Something lower and more guttural. The sound of an animal registering the presence of something categorically outside its familiar world. The light under the basement door came on. I should wake Jonah, I said. He's already awake, Franny said. I heard his door. As if on cue, Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was fully dressed, which meant he had not been asleep. He looked at the basement door, at the strip of light beneath it, at Franny and me at the table. You read it? He said to Franny. She looked at him with surprise. You knew? I found a different paper 2 weeks ago, he said. Urban planning literature, there's a category of historical urban sites classified as having unusual occupancy patterns. This address is in the database. Came fully into the kitchen and sat down. He was very calm. Jonah's calm, I had learned in the weeks of living with him, was not the calm of someone who didn't feel things. It was the calm of someone who had decided that how he felt was not the most important information in the room. I've been trying to figure out what the acknowledgement was supposed to be, the reciprocal boundary maintenance, what it required. And I said, I haven't figured it out yet, he said. I think we're running out of time to figure it out. Below us, the sound continued. Patient, rhythmic, getting very gradually, almost imperceptibly louder. Let me tell you what was below the house. I will tell it plainly, because the plain telling is the honest one. And I have been trying very hard to be honest since the night I realized I had been 17 warnings into something before. I understood what I was in the middle of. Honesty, I've decided, is the least I can offer in place of the attention I failed to give. Jonah had been researching for 2 weeks. He had academic papers and historical property records and 2 phone calls with a researcher at a university. Urban planning department who had studied the unusual occupancy pattern properties and who had been professionally cautious in a way that Jonah read. Correctly as personal knowledge, he was not prepared to put in a paper. He had notes in a document he'd titled simply Fell Street, in which he opened on the kitchen table while the sound below us continued, and the strip of light under the basement door remained steady. The chamber below the basement was not unique. This was the first thing the research had established. There were documented examples in 7 other cities, all northeastern. It's all predating European settlement and their foundational structures of what the urban planning literature classified as persistent subsurface anomalies. The chambers varied in size and form, but shared certain consistent characteristics. Stone construction of very old type, interior markings of a specific category, and a consistent pattern in the properties built above them of high tenancy turnover. Unusual atmospheric qualities reported by occupants, and what the literature delicately called elevated incidence of occupant-reported sensory anomalies. The second thing the research had established, and this was what Jonah had spent most of his 2 weeks on, was the nature of the agreement. The reciprocal boundary maintenance. Because the paper that Franny had found was not the only one, and several of the others, written from the perspectives of different disciplines, converged on a description that was more specific than acknowledgement. The chambers were old. Older than the buildings above them. Older than the city. Older than any record of the land they sat beneath. They were not burial sites. They were not storage chambers. The best framework the research offered, and Jonah said this with the carefulness of a man who was trained in evidence-based analysis and was currently using that training to describe something that barely fit any evidence-based framework, was that they were sites of a specific kind of cohabitation agreement, a contract entered into at some point so long ago that the parties to it had passed into the category of legend on one side and geological memory on the other, stipulating that the space above the chamber could be occupied by human beings in exchange for regular, specific, form-required acknowledgement of what occupied the space below. What occupied the space below? I said. Jonah looked at his notes. The papers don't agree on a category. Some describe it as geological, a feature of the land itself, a kind of sentient property of the specific combination of rock and water and age. Some describe it in terms of what the indigenous frameworks called a presence that predates the human world. Some, the less academically cautious ones, describe it as something that simply is, that exists at a depth and on a time scale that human categories don't map onto cleanly. He paused. The consistent thread is that it's not malicious. It's not trying to hurt anyone. It's operating within the terms of a contract that most of its modern tenants don't know exists. And when the terms aren't met, he stopped. What? Franny asked. It reminds them, he said. The occupant reported sensory anomalies, the dreams, the sounds, atmospheric qualities, the animal behavior. He looked at Hex, who had not moved from Franny's side. These are the reminders. The contract coming due. The thing below trying to collect the acknowledgement that the current occupants don't know they owe. And if the acknowledgement doesn't come, I said, the tenancy turnover, the average of 4 months. What happens at 4 months? Jonah was quiet for a moment. The reminders become harder to ignore, he said carefully. According to the research, presence becomes more direct, more insistent, not violent. But beyond the point where you can continue to file it under ordinary explanation. A pause. Most tenants leave. Some leave quite suddenly, apparently. Which is why the tenancy lengths are so short. Some leave with explanations they don't fully give to the property management company. And some, I said. The ones who stayed, he said. There were 3 cases where tenants stayed longer than 6 months. 2 of those sets of tenants were still in residence in the recorded data, 1 for 3 years, 1 for 11. The third case was a single occupant who stayed for 42 years and whose property was eventually inherited by a family member who sold it. They figured out the acknowledgement, Franny said. I believe so, Jonah said, but the papers don't record what it was. Just that the turnover pattern ended, that the property became settled. The sound below us did something it hadn't done before. It stopped being periodic and became continuous. A long, sustained frequency, felt in the chest as much as heard by the ear, not threatening in quality, not aggressive. The quality of a thing that has been patient for a very long time and has arrived at the end of its patience. How do we find out what the acknowledgement is? I said. My voice was steady. What surprised me, Jonah looked at his notes and then at me, with an expression that combined professional calm with the specific honesty of someone who is going to say something he knows will not be comfortable. "I think we have to ask," he said. "There was a conversation about whether all three of us should go, or whether one should go, or whether we should wait until morning when the light would change the quality of things." Franny said that waiting until morning was a management strategy, not a solution, and that management strategies were what had gotten us to day 30 with 17 unread warnings. Jonah said that whoever went should go with clear intention and honest speech, because every piece of research he'd read converged on the idea that the thing below responded to honesty in a way it did not respond to avoidance. I said that all. 3 of us should go, because whatever we owed, it was owed by the household, not by an individual. We went down together. The basement stairs were the same stairs they'd always been. The staircase you went down to do laundry. The staircase you passed by without thinking. The third stair screamed under our collective weight, which was, under the circumstances, the most ordinary thing that had happened in hours. I almost laughed. I didn't, but the impulse was there. The basement was lit by the light that had turned itself on. The finished space, laundry room to the left, storage room to the right. The open room straight ahead that we'd been using as a secondary sitting room was exactly as we'd left it. Our things in the storage room, the washer and dryer, the second-hand sofa and the side table with the lamp in the sitting room, and in the northwest corner of the sitting room floor, which I had walked across dozens of times and which I now looked at with new attention, a seam in the linoleum. It's not a wear crack, a seam, deliberate, rectangular, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, with a small recessed handle that I had never noticed because I had never been looking for it. The crawl space. The 3 of us stood around it for a moment. "The chamber is below this," Jonah said. "Yes," I said. Franny crouched and looked at the handle. "It's been opened before," she said. She had the designer's eye for surface evidence, where patterns use marks. Recently, not by us. She looked up at Jonah and then at me. It comes up. The sound, which had been continuous since the kitchen, stopped. Absolute silence, not the ordinary silence of a quiet night. The deliberate silence of something that has stopped doing what it was doing. Because something has changed. Because we were here. Because we were standing over the crawl space with our honest intentions and our assembled research and our 31 days of unread warnings. And we were here. I crouched beside Franny. "I put my hand on the recessed handle," Sable Jonah said. "Before you open that," I looked up. "The research on what the acknowledgement requires," he said. The consistent thread across all the cases was that it needed to be given from the space of the chamber. In the space, the tenants who stayed, the 3 who figured it out, they all went in. "The chamber," Franny said. "Into the chamber," he confirmed. I looked at the handle, at the seam around the crawlspace hatch, at the floor that had been walked over and ignored for 31 days while the warnings accumulated, and the basement. Light turned itself on, and the cat refused to approach the stairs. "Okay," I said. "I'll go in. We'll all go in," Franny said. "Household, remember?" I pulled the handle. The hatch came up cleanly and without resistance, as though it had been waiting. Below it, a short ladder, 4 rungs, descending into a space. Lit by no visible source but not dark. The chamber had a faint luminescence. Stone light. If stone could be said to carry light, that was enough to see by. Stone walls, stone floor. Space roughly 10 feet square and 5 feet high, and on the walls, the marks that Franny had been drawing in her sleep for 3 weeks. Not threatening marks, not arcane symbols in the horror movie sense. Marks that were, when you looked at them with the full attention you should have been giving things for a month, simply old. The oldest marks I had ever seen. Marks that predated everything I knew about the human marking of surfaces. We went down. The chamber was cold and dry and smelled of the underground smell, the geological, stone-old, wet then dry smell I'd been noticing in the kitchen and the back hallway for 3 weeks. Down here it was not intermittent, but it was the atmosphere. of the place, the full quality of the air, and it was not unpleasant. It was simply old. Older than the building above it, older than the city, older than the memory of anyone who had lived in either. We stood in the chamber, and the stone light gave us to each other in pale shapes, and the marks on the walls were all around us, and the sound, the breathing, the three-cycle rhythm was completely gone. "Now what?" Franny said. "Now we acknowledge it," Jonah said, "whatever that means, however it needs to be done." "We don't know the form," I said. "The specific form the acknowledgement is supposed to take. The paper said it was form required, but didn't record what the form was." I think Jonah said slowly, looking at the marks on the walls, that the form is what we have, what we bring. There's no single universal form for any of these sites. The research was inconsistent. The successful tenants all seemed to have done something different in the specific details. The consistent thread was honesty and presence, and he paused, and reciprocity. Acknowledging that you've received something from this place and giving something in return. We had received something from this place. I stood in the chamber and I took stock of that, because I had been a data analyst for 5 years, and taking stock was the work I knew how to do. What did we receive from the house on Fell Street? Received 3 roommates, not 2. 3, Jonah and Franny, and whatever had been accumulating in the basement. The presence that had been sending warnings in the language of a building and a cat and a smell and a sound, trying to be acknowledged, trying to collect on a contract that my lease had implicitly continued. The house had given me the closest thing to genuine community I'd had in 5 years of living in this city. The breakfasts and the films by the fire, and the kitchen table conversations, and the sense of being in a place that was larger than myself. And it had given me, through the accumulation of 17 warnings I'd almost missed, the specific and important lesson that I had been looking without seeing for a very long time. I said this out loud in the chamber, to the stone walls and the marks and the old air. I said, "I'm Sable. I've been here for 31 days, and I should have been paying attention from the first. I wasn't. I'm a data analyst. I find patterns for a living, and I spent a month not assembling the pattern that was in front of me because I decided each piece was ordinary. That was the wrong call, and I understand that now." I paused. "What you gave us in this house is better than what I expected when I signed the lease. I expected a place to sleep and a place to work. I got people I want to keep knowing, and lesson I needed. I think that's the bargain. I think that's what you've been trying to collect." Franny spoke next. She had been looking at the marks on the walls with the focused attention of someone whose profession is visual communication. She had been translating them in the way of her specific intelligence, not linguistically, but in terms of form. An intention and the grammar of marks made by something that needed to express something without human language. "The marks," she said quietly to the chamber, "are a record, aren't they, of the agreements, of the ones who stayed and the ones who left." She traced the wall with her eyes, not touching. "I've been dreaming about these for 3 weeks, and the dreams were trying to teach me to read them, and I kept filing them under sleep disturbance rather than looking." She paused. "I'm Franny. I make things that communicate. I should have been better at recognizing communication. That wasn't in my usual format. I'm sorry I wasn't." And she paused again. "I want to stay. I want to learn to read what's on these walls. I think that might be part of what I owe." Jonah was last. He stood in the center of the chamber with his hands loose at his sides, the posture of someone who is fully present, not braced, not armored. And he said, "I'm Jonah. I'm an urban planner. I spend my professional life figuring out how human systems and existing conditions coexist, how you build what people need without destroying what was already there. And I've been living above the oldest existing condition I've ever encountered, and treating it as a research project rather than a relationship. That's backwards." He looked at the walls. Urban planning at its best is about agreements, about the terms under which different things occupy the same space. I want to honor the agreement that this space has always operated under. I want to understand the terms well enough to meet them. The chamber was silent. The stone light was steady. The marks on the walls did not change or move or signal anything that I could measure. But something in the quality of the air changed. I have tried many times to describe this, and the closest I can get is this. It was like the moment in a conversation when the other person, whoever they are, whatever the conversation has cost them, begins to believe you. A specific shift from held breath to something more open. The change in atmosphere that happens when words have landed in the way they were meant to. The chamber received us. That is the only accurate description. It received what we'd brought. Not a ritual, not a performance, just 3 people in a cold stone room saying true things, and it received it. We were in the chamber for perhaps 45 minutes. I am imprecise about this because time felt different down there, not distorted, not dreamlike, but measured differently. In the way of a place that has been measuring time by its own system for much longer than the system that produced my watch. When we came back up the ladder and Jonah closed the hatch, the basement was different. Not visibly. The same sofa, the same laundry appliances, the same storage room with our things. But the quality of the space had changed in the specific way of a room that has been holding its breath and has let it out. The underground smell was gone from the air. Strip of light under the basement door was gone because the light had turned itself off. Hex was at the top of the basement stairs, not doing his usual focused assessment routine, not deciding. He was simply there, sitting in his large gray way. And when we came up the stairs, he stood and walked with us back to the kitchen without any sign of the months-long boredom he had maintained at the top of the steps. Franny noticed. She looked at the cat and at me and at Jonah, and she said very quietly, "He came to the stairs." "Yes," I said. "He's never done that." "No," I said. "He hasn't." We made tea because at 3 in the morning, after the experience we'd had, the act of making tea was the right calibration back to the ordinary. We sat at the kitchen table and drank it and said relatively little because we had said the things that needed to be said in the right place for saying them, and what the kitchen table required now was quiet and warmth and the ordinary. Companionship of people who have been through something together. At some point, Franny said, "I want to learn to read the marks." I wasn't just saying that. I think it matters. "I know someone at the university," Jonah said. "The researcher I spoke with, the one who was careful about what he put in papers. I think he knows more than he published. I think he might talk. If we approached it right." "What does approached it right mean?" I asked honestly, Jonah said. "From a position of genuine engagement with what's there, rather than academic extraction of data from it." He looked at his tea. "The same thing the chamber required." I thought about that. I thought about the 17 warnings and the 31 days and the accumulation of evidence I had refused to assemble. I thought about the pattern recognition I did professionally and had failed to do personally, and about what that failure had cost, not disastrously, it turned out, but close enough to disastrous to be instructive. Franny's late-night research session had been the thing that closed the gap. Her 3 weeks of vivid, specific dreams and her designer's instinct to draw what she saw in the dreams and then research. What she'd drawn had been what made the document legible in time. "I need to be better at this," I said. "At recognizing warnings," Jonah asked. "At assembling the data I have into the conclusions it points toward," I said. "I've been treating my personal life the way a bad analyst treats a data set processing. Each point in isolation, instead of looking at the pattern across all of them." I paused. "I'm genuinely good at my job. I'm terrible at doing the same thing in the parts of my life that aren't my job." "That's an extremely relatable problem," Franny said. "I know," I said. "It's just that most people's version of that problem doesn't result in an ancient subterranean presence trying to collect on a pre-colonial cohabitation agreement." Jonah made a sound that was almost a laugh, then actually a laugh. And then all 3 of us were laughing at the kitchen table at 3:40 in the morning with Hex on Franny's lap and the tea cooling in our mugs. The house around us was warm and ordinary and entirely quietly settled. We stayed. Obviously, we stayed. I want to be clear about this, because the natural instinct, having survived the experience of not noticing 17 warnings in a haunted-ish, it's a house for a month, might be to leave. to find a house without a pre-colonial cohabitation agreement in the basement, to prioritize an uncomplicated living situation, the natural instinct would be wrong. And I say this as someone who now professionally understands the value of getting the conclusion right. We stayed. We renewed the lease at the 6-month mark with a communication to the property management company that was measured and professional and contained a sentence. We are aware of the historical context of the property and intend to maintain appropriate stewardship. The response was a brief email from Derek, the plumber, who had asked you all doing okay here, in the way of a real question, which said, "That's wonderful to hear. Please don't hesitate to reach out." Jonah contacted the university researcher. His name was Dr. Matthias Webb. He was 62 years old and had been studying the unusual occupants of pattern properties for over 20 years and had, as Jonah predicted, significantly more knowledge than his published work indicated. He came to the house on Fell Street in December and sat in our kitchen and talked with us for 4 hours. What Dr. Webb told us filled in the significant gaps. The chamber was approximately 900 years old. Based on the dating of the construction methods and the specific limestone used, the marks on the walls were in a writing system associated with the Lenape people who had inhabited this region before European colonization and who had a documented tradition, known in the oral record but poorly represented in written scholarship, of designating specific underground sites as boundary spaces, sites of coexistence, sites where the human world and what lived below the human world maintained an active relationship. The relationship was not hierarchical in either direction. The thing below was not worshipped. People above were not subjects. The agreement was between equals who occupied different registers of existence and who had decided, at some point 900 years ago, to acknowledge each other's presence and the value of coexistence. The Victorian above it has no idea what it's sitting on, Dr. Webb said, looking at the ceiling as if he could see through it. None of the buildings built over these sites do. The agreement predates the buildings by centuries. The buildings are, from the chamber's perspective, the most recent in a very long series of structures that human beings have constructed on this particular piece of ground. He paused. It has been patient. It has been very patient, Franny said. She had her sketchbook open. She'd been drawing the marks from memory for 2 months, refining her understanding of them. And Dr. Webb had spent an hour helping her decode the grammar of what she'd recorded. What does it want from the people above it? I asked. In the long run? Not the monthly acknowledgement, the bigger picture? Dr. Webb thought about this carefully. The oral record suggests that the boundary spaces were established because the indigenous community recognized that what lived below the ground had as much claim to the territory as what lived above it. The acknowledgement was not propitiation, not an offering to prevent something bad. It was recognition. It's the same recognition you would give to any neighbor who shared your space. He paused. What it wants, I think, is to not be forgotten, to have the people who occupy the space above it understand that the space has depth, that the world they live in goes further down than the floor of their basement. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The world goes further down than the floor of your basement. The land under the city is not empty, not merely geological, not simply the foundation that the human-built world rests on. It has its own history, its own occupants, its own time frame. What we build on it is the newest layer. What was there before continues to be there, below and alongside, requiring only that we not pretend it doesn't exist. This felt, to me, the data analyst who found patterns in large systems for a living like the most important pattern one had ever assembled from a set of data points, not about the chamber specifically, about everything. About the world, which is older and larger and more occupied than the version of it that we navigate day to day, which requires of us only the acknowledgement that it is. It has been 8 months since the night in the kitchen, and 6 months since the night in the chamber. We are still in the house on Fell Street. We have been there longer than any previous tenants in over 20 years. The basement light no longer turns itself on. The underground smell no longer visits the kitchen. The sound has not returned. Hex goes to the top of the basement stairs. Regularly now, not with the focused borderline vigilance of an animal guarding a threshold. but with the relaxed attention of an animal that has accepted the stairs as part of his domain. He has not gone down, but he has stopped treating the staircase as a line he cannot cross. Franny has filled 2 sketchbooks with the marks from the chamber walls. Dr. Webb has been collaborating with her on a paper, a genuine academic paper, carefully and honestly written, that will document the marks and their relationship to the Lenape boundary space tradition. She has been in contact with a cultural preservation organization connected to the Lenape Nation, and those conversations have been, she says, among the most meaningful she has ever had. The marks in that context are not mysterious. Records. A long, careful, specific record of every agreement this piece of ground has been party to. Going back 900 years, Jonah has changed the way he works. He has been advocating within his city planning department for a protocol of subsurface historical assessment before major urban development projects, not just the standard archaeological requirement, but a deeper category of assessment that considers what the ground remembers, what it carries, what agreements may still be active in the layers below the proposed development. His colleagues think this is interesting in the way that colleagues think unusual things are interesting. Before they become policy, he is patient. He has learned from the chamber what patience looks like. I have changed the way I analyze data. Why not the methodology? The methodology is sound, but the philosophy. I have stopped treating anomalous data points as problems, too. Be resolved and started treating them as the most important information in the set. The things that don't fit the expected pattern are not noise. They are what the pattern is trying to tell you. They are warnings. 17 of them. I missed 17 of them. And by the grace of Franny's sleepless research session and Jonah's 2 weeks of quietly assembled knowledge and the patience of something 900 years old that was willing to keep trying to collect its acknowledgement, rather than simply expelling us the way it had expelled 14 previous tendencies, I had just enough time, not too late. Almost too late? What? Almost is the most important word in this story, because here is what I know about warnings now. 8 months and a great deal of accumulated pattern later, they do not arrive with sirens. They arrive as ordinary things, asking only that you look carefully enough to see them for what they are. A cat that won't go down the stairs. A neighbor who doesn't wave back. A plumber who asks if you're okay in the tone of a real question. A smell that comes and goes. Sound that stops when you start listening. The world is full of warnings. The world is full of things trying to communicate with you in the language of what they are, not the language you expect, not the format you're accustomed to, but the language they have, offered honestly and repeatedly and with more patience than you have earned. The only wrong response is to not assemble the data. Don't do what I did. Look at the ordinary things. Read the pattern they make. Everything important that has ever happened to me happened first as something I almost missed. End.